Jetzt geht's.
Jetzt sind wir live. Gut, herzlich willkommen. Welcome to the first lecture or in the year 2022 in the module of emerging fields in architecture. I'm very happy to welcome Sabine Knierbein. The lecture today will be in English, that is why I will introduce her also in English. Sabine Knierbein is the head of the Interdisciplinary Center for Urban Culture and Public Space at the Faculty of Architecture and Planning at the TUWien. Trained originally in landscape architecture, she received the first doctorate at the Faculty of Architecture of the Bauhaus University at Weimar, ever in the field of European urban studies. She also holds a Journeywoman's certificate as a landscape gardener, and she's also the founding member of the thematic group of public spaces and urban cultures of the Association of European Schools of Planning. Sabine Knierbein has worked in Argentina, Austria, Germany, and the UK. She has taught university courses in Paris, Rome, Stockholm, Thessaloniki, Vienna, Weimar, and Zagreb. In 2020, Sabine held a visiting professorship for urban political geography at the University degli Studi di Firenze in Florence, Italy, where she focused on geographies of everyday encounter. In 2021, she received the Venia in Urban Studies at the TUWien at the Faculty of Architecture and Planning. This was based on her treatise titled Critique of Everyday Life in the 21st Century, Lived Space and Capitalist Urbanization. Sabine Knierbein's publications are available in German, English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish, and her two latest books that she co-edited with Woodledge is Care and the City, Encounters with Urban Studies, and Urban Life Unsettled, Routines, Temporalities, and Contestations. Thank you very much, Sabine Knierbein. We are looking forward to hearing more about your work. This is your floor.
Thanks so much, Sandra, for the very kind invite, and welcome everyone. Welcome to the students. Welcome to everyone who's following us on the stream as well. I'll now share my screen. And if there's any technical issues during the presentation, please just let me know, best, I guess, via the acoustic medium so that we can solve that quickly. Okay. So I'll share my presentation. And Sandra, you already addressed, let's say, the work of the Venia Docendi, that I defended last year at the Faculty of Architecture and Planning. Thus, also somehow establishing a new emerging field in architecture. That's also why I very much liked your title of your lecture, because I think it's very interesting to have a look at how architecture is transforming in these very unsettled times somehow. And today I'm going to talk about, that was the title offered by you, Sandra, adaptive architecture. And I also liked it very much because sort of to see how we always have to transform our understanding of architecture as everyday life is transforming. Yeah, so, and that's very, very important. And today I'll talk about lived space in everyday life. And especially because I know most of you are architects, I would like to propose a reading of architectural praxis from an urban studies perspective. And of course, I will introduce you to that perspective so that you can identify from which perspectives we are talking. Yeah. And first, before we start with the official presentation, somehow I would like to get some ideas from you. But before I do so, this is just a link to our web page. So everyone who's interested in following which courses we offer, etc., just have a look at our web page. You will see the URL link here above. And so that you also know that this is also existing at the Faculty of Architecture. And we offer basically courses for master and PhD students, but now next term, we will also start with bachelor introductory courses to urban studies. Okay, so the next point is that I would like to invite you to a joint Mentimeter. Those of you who already know it, just take a photo of the QR code with your smartphone if you have one, or if you have a computer, you can also log on to www.menti.com and use the code. And I'm going to copy the code also into the chat so that you have it present. That just takes a second. I copy that into the chat, and then you can actually, we'll open, I'll de-share this screen, and I'll share the Menti screen. And I would like to ask everyone to insert 3 key words that with the 2 questions that I have. And the first question is actually, what would you consider as the social in architecture? Yeah, and I think I have to go to presentations and also present. So please type in what you consider as the social in architecture. So in your architectural praxis, where would you locate the social? What are social aspects of architecture? When you build, when you do master planning, when you work in the office? And please type in 3 points you have in mind. Does that work with the access? Ah, yeah, okay. So, and I'll start commenting right now. So some of you say that you create like space for humans, you also deal with public spaces, you deal with sort of aspects of urban life, but then also you have like very precise objects like kitchens, benches. Then you talk about openness of design, you talk about flexibility, and also you mentioned the workspace itself as a social space. I guess that's of key relevance, yeah. And maybe we see if there's more ideas flocking in here, yeah. So the social aspects of architecture in all its dimensions, I guess, is important. So yes, you mentioned also plazas, parks, playgrounds, accessibility. Very important, and also this idea that maybe we have varying degrees between shared spaces, community spaces, and public spaces. Yeah, so some are more intimate and some are more openly accessible. Okay, fantastic. That's a good first round. We see if there are more comments to that. Yes. So you also talk about equality. Yeah, so there are some more democratic principles maybe in our practice that we have to obey to, or at least reflect upon. And then you talk about communication, the inclusion of people, so that the cities we create somehow are accessible and inclusive and human oriented. Some of you mentioned the working hours, but you see the most important aspects mentioned here are urban life and public spaces. So that's the aspects that most people of you have realized. Affordability is a key issue also in relation to the relationship between housing and public space, and also here aspects of implementation and efficiency. So it's not just sufficient to have just inclusive plans, but we also need to see when we implement our constructions and plans into built infrastructures that these processes are equally inclusive. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. I'll go with you to the next question straight away. And it's the same QR code, so you should be able to just click on that when I open it now. So I think I lost my screen sharing. I have to share it again. Apologies, that happens with technology. No, that's the wrong one. Apologies. So the next one is, in your future architectural praxis, how do you integrate social aspects in this architectural praxis? Some of you might be working already in offices, and I would like to know how you can be, let's say, what can you do in order to integrate these social aspects in your praxis? Okay, so some of you mentioned that you anyway talk a lot of the future inhabitants during the planning process. And there's this distinction between urban extension and urban renewal, yeah, because in urban extension projects, you often don't have so many people already living there, whereas in urban renewal, in the built city parts, you have already people living in these parts. So there's also distinctions between different strategic approaches to urban development. You cooperate with clients, and that's a social interaction as well. And yeah, you say we take care of each other's needs. That's also maybe an issue of the office space. Yeah, so to what extent is the office team really a team where you have buddies taking care of each other, and also seeing how each person doing architecture is somehow included. I guess the idea of how we live our office spaces plays about a lot of how we actually build our spaces and how we can imagine accessibility and inclusion also in building cities. Yeah. And you also mentioned design should be made for humans, not for investors. Lamentably, investors are humans as well. So, so we need to see how that is also somehow a paradox. Analysis of users, so which potential users could live there. Also talk to all the involved interest groups and try to find a good compromise for everybody. That's a very good intent, but it's not always possible. So sometimes you have to live with conflict or dissent, and that's even a bit more tricky and challenging. Yeah. You create spaces for communication, and through surveys and cooperation with different, you mentioned target groups. I would invite you to not talk about target groups because that's very military language, but talk about city publics, which is something that should be always open and inclusive. Yeah. And you also build for the people. So you convince investors to create something with value to the public. That's very important. And you focus on community and psychological needs. And of course, this is even more so important during pandemic times, but it has already been important prior to pandemic times as well. So thanks for that. I'll wait a last round if someone else comments. Yeah, that's sort of very good to start from. And if there's no further comment here, we come back and start with the real presentation. So many thanks for that. And we'll start off now with the presentation itself. So I guess you got a good sense. Maybe I can make it a bit bigger. Oh, no, that doesn't work. Sorry, I just have to test something. Okay, let's try it like that. Do you see the screen right now? Completely, fully? I hope so. If yes. Not, okay, thank you. So what we are actually going to talk about today is structured in 3 parts. So when I talk about adaptive architecture and lived space in everyday life, I would first like to introduce this idea of public space to you, but also by pointing to what we have coined as transdisciplinary terms in architecture and planning. And in part 2, I would like to come back to this idea of public space on a very conceptual level. And I would like to introduce you some problems with the concept of public space, because it has had its own conjunctures, but it also, especially in the community of international public space researchers, which is a subfield in urban studies to which I pertain, we have started to develop also a critique of public space, because there has been some problems with the concept. Yeah, it has been misused somehow. And then we come to this idea of, because in my habilitation treatise, I try to draw some connections between social sciences and humanities approaches to urban studies and actually planning theory and architectural theory. And today, of course, as this is a course in architecture and about emerging fields of architecture, I would very much like to develop more and discuss more with you this architectural theory points, while also diving a bit deeper into this idea of the critique of everyday life. Yeah. So, and as regards questions, if you have questions of understanding, I would propose that we have a short round after each part, so you can have them directly for each part, and the discussion then by the end, if that's possible for you. Yeah, but if there's something urgent in between, just feel free also to raise your hand. Okay, so I can see that. Okay. And I guess there's also the opportunity for those who follow us on stream to also have some comments on YouTube, which are then taken in by Sandra later on. Yeah. So part 1 is about this so-called transdisciplinary turns in architecture. Maybe first, how interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity are distinct from each other. Interdisciplinarity is something that we do, for example, we have different departments, disciplines in the university as a bureaucratic institution. The same happens for example, the city of Vienna. You have different departments and resorts like silos. And actually, the interdisciplinarity refers actually to this cooperation between these different resources on an equal level of knowledge. Yeah. Transdisciplinarity is something different, because transdisciplinarity very much tackles the relation between different forms of knowledge, for example, practical knowledge, site-based knowledge, or experiential knowledge that we gain from our experiences, and the different forms of scientific knowledge. So there's a wider reach of different knowledges that we can include, particularly when we work at the interface between theory and praxis, and don't highlight these divisions between praxis and theory, but rather see how theory always builds from praxis, and how praxis is always the final ending point of any theories. Yeah. So more a dialectical understanding of this interrelation between theory and praxis. That's important to start from. Okay, let's start with public spaces, and maybe as a precursor also what you have to expect. So the lecture will be not so much on case studies or on building techniques, but really very conceptual. But I think it's very important in these unsettled times of facing different moments of crisis, where we have so many thoughts on the role of architecture in society, to bring us back to this thinking, also back again to think about what could be different roles of architecture in society. And that's why we really have to dig a bit deeper into what's the social, what's our everyday life, what's our Alltag, what's our lived space, would be gelebter oder erlebter Raum. Yeah, so what's the spaces that we live actually currently in our cities, in our communities, in our public villages, etc. Yeah. Okay, so public space actually is, there have been some definitions that could be understood as being spaces where public life may eventually unfold. So there's an opportunity of something emerging and unfolding in public spaces. And public space is also the geography of the public sphere. And that's interesting. So you could ask me now, what's the differentiation between public space and public sphere? Yeah. And where public space, as we see in the first quote, very much relates to this idea of public life, like life happening outside on Karlsplatz, in other squares, in streets, in public transport, etc. So that's very much public life. But public sphere is very much about political opinion formation. So how a political public opinion comes into being. And Habermas' idea was that people meet in a cafe and discuss the very important things, and then they get maybe distributed by the media, etc., and get discussed. Yeah. And what Cesar Lowe and Neil Smith, they are both based in New York. What they have found in their book on politics of public space is that in order to understand how a public political opinion comes to be formed, which would be about the public sphere, we need to understand how public life is going in the public spaces. So that's why they coined these public spaces the geography of the public sphere. And Gary Bridge and Sophie Watson actually also referred to this idea that, on the one hand, I mean, as architects and planners, we work very rationally. We have to have our sort of building codes, legal issues, construction principles. The same in planning, we have a lot of rational ideas about what should be good planning about. But if we talk about public space, another dimension on top of all these rational ideas comes into play. That's the idea of passion, of affect, of feelings. Yeah, so we are not just rational beings, we are just also beings living in our experience, and then we cannot downplay all the affective expressions, for example, of political opinion that we find in our public spaces, especially currently, sometimes also connected to populism, polarization. That's also something that we need to see in all its ambivalences. But it's very important to see this idea of the social, not just in the rational, but always in the passionate, in the, let's say, to be a bit more Freudian here. Yeah, Freud would always talk about the passions and lust, but also about trauma, and involve these both aspects into our understanding of everyday life and public space. Yeah, and that's why we talk also about the performativity of social action, going beyond rational discourse. Public space is also a focal lens in the wider field of urban studies. It's like an analytical gaze into the field, yeah? And I can tell you that as regards public spaces, at least 20 academic disciplines work on public spaces. So no discipline can lay claim to own public space and public space research. And the same is with urban studies, because in urban studies, and that's why we often say it's not a discipline, it's a field of fields, we try to bring together different fields of disciplinary knowledges and dig into the niches that are between these disciplinary fields of knowledges. Yeah, because disciplines usually have their proper bodies of knowledge and they further develop it. And maybe they overlap if they would do interdisciplinary work, but we don't so much look into the niches that remain open and unexplored between these disciplinary bodies of knowledge. And that's what urban studies is about, basically. Yeah, we look both into the fields and into disciplinary knowledge, but we also look into these unexplored niches in between. Yeah. And public space in this sense is also a key ingredient within contemporary spatial planning and urban development practices. And it has been a key, and that's one of the problematic issues, it has been a key concept of urban policy, embracing the last aspect here, its overall positive connotations of access, inclusion, integration, cohesion, and at its best also democracy. Yeah. But public space, as I said, needs to be understood a bit more ambivalent, because we have an everyday conflict, also because different interests meet. Yeah. And what we need to see is also how we can not, let's say, not negate that this conflict or this dissent is existing, but rather try to bring it back to a political debates that share certain humanist or democratic values. Yeah, so that's very important. And I guess architecture and planning can contribute to that very much. And when we talk about which ideas of space lie behind these ideas of public spaces, very often in planning, there has been a social turn in the 90s already, and I guess we see that social turn in architecture now very strongly as well. So we talk on the one hand about relational conceptions of public spaces as being both material or physical spaces that are built infrastructures, but also social spaces. And what's important here is that this is not just let's say the social and the material, the physical, are not two distinct spaces, but rather these are two aspects of the same coin. Yeah, two facets of the same coin. And that's why we also do a lot of theorization of space. And if you are interested in theories of space in the social sciences, humanities, and how that links to our fields of architecture, planning, urban design, landscape architecture, then we also have a whole lecture series on that in the winter term, and you're very much invited to attend that. Yeah. And Danielle Irnaud-Nicolas wrote that social relations only gain real existence in and for space. So their support is material. And that is also interesting for us in the spatial arts, yeah, because every social action has a materiality through our own bodies, but also through what our bodies do and shape. Yeah. So that's also why we have extended this relational understanding of public space to a relational / material understanding of public space. Yeah, because the relations and the materiality always go together. And Panu Lehtuvori, who's a very dear colleague from Finland and has written a very important book on public space and conflict in Helsinki urban development. Panu said that if space in general can, with difficult reductions, be conceptualized as an abstract, three-dimensional continuum or a container or a material substance, public urban space clearly cannot. And he would say you cannot only consider public space just in Cartesian coordinates. Yeah, it's impossible. There's always social life playing into that definition of public space. And others have considered public spaces as relational web of persons, places, and connections. That was Lynn Loveland, one of the first public space researchers, already in the 1990s. Fran Tonquist, who is at the city center at the London School of Economics, she talks about public spaces as a condition or symbol for human relations. And that's very important. So the human condition can be read through an analysis of changing public spaces. And that's something I will come back to you later in this lecture. And instead of abstractly classifying different aspects of space or assuming structural similarities between them, that's again Panu Lehtovuori from Finland. The dynamic theory of space entails a dialectic understanding of relations between physical, social, and he adds mental aspects. And Henri Lefebvre, whom some of you might have come across because he's one of some have called him the founding father of critical urban studies. He was a French social theorist, a very contested one, but also a very enriching one. And Lefebvre said that the apparently direct relations between persons and things or goods are precisely what the everyday is made up of. And he refers to the everyday also as including different modalities of social consciousness. Yeah. And I will come back to this everyday dimension as follows. And you see some books about these relational terms in the conceptions of public spaces. First of all, in urban design, there was Margaret Crawford, and she wrote it with two colleagues, actually, Everyday Urbanism, and they revolutionized, let's say, traditional conceptions of urban design and Städtebau, and proposed an alltäglichen Städtebau somehow, an everyday urbanism. Yeah. And then we have Jeffrey Ho's very prominent book, Insurgent Public Space, where he talks about bottom-up movements, grassroots movements that emerge from public spaces and that are partly able even to reform politics and take over also more political positions later onwards. And Jeff has been a visiting professor with us a couple of years ago. And the third book that you can see here, Public Space and Relational Perspectives, is a book that we published in 2015 at our center, where we try to reflect on the pedagogies of the classroom and how this should be, how we develop social interaction and social relations in our seminar rooms and lecture halls and classrooms very much affects the way how we are able to envisage a more inclusive public space. Yeah, so this idea that didactics and pedagogy have a lot to do with how we design. Yeah, and everyone who's interested in that, the last book is also available for free in the TU catalog. Yeah, and I am in my habilitation treatise. I then said that we also face something like what I called a new relational mainstream in architecture and planning. What does that mean? It's quite abstract. Yeah. So this new relational mainstream relates to academic centers or extensions. An extension is actually a bridging institution in university that should bridge towards society, yeah, that works a bit more with associations and NGOs, etc. So does the citizen science part. So academic centers, extensions, or academic programs in which urban development issues are taught, which emphasize first a context-specific and a people-centered approach to space, and away, as I briefly explained before, from so-called container conceptions of space, and also social space-based conceptions of public spaces and urban cultures. Yeah, that of course there is spaces, there is for different urban cultures, there's also a spatial dimension, and we need to see how these cultures modify, appropriate, or self-build their spaces. Or if it's high culture, how architecture has provided also, of course, very representative buildings for high culture. You see that in a lot of opera houses and museums, and you see that currently the Wien Museum at Karlsplatz is under reconstruction to give it a new sense also. It's very interesting. But also then what this new relational mainstream in architecture and planning does is definitely a cross-disciplinary approach to curricula, yeah, to Lehrpläne, and also to student cohorts. So what we very often do in our courses is really mixing students from different disciplines. We have students from sociology. Sometimes we have students from the University of Business Economics or from the Angewandte or from the Academy of Arts. So also mixing, let's say, the body of students to have a wider discussion about urban phenomena and urban development. And Many of these institutions focus on everyday life and everyday practices, and thereby also on different forms of everyday knowledge somehow. And they work, to do that, they work with civic associations, NGOs, activists, artists, churches, Caritas, and all what you can imagine, different associations that work with different social groups. Could be drug substitution centers, yeah, women's protection centers against domestic violence, etc. So all these are very important players and collaboration partners in that type of urban development. And what this new relational mainstream is focusing on, and that refers to a shift in planning traditions, that we do inclusion through action rather than participation through discourse and deliberation and through words. So the participation through deliberation refers to a paradigm in planning that's called communicative planning or deliberative planning, where we very much find a good argument in our discourse and then realize what has been discussed. And that's hardly possible, for example, in redeveloping the Reinbrechtsdorfer Straße in Vienna. You have 20,000 people, of which 2/3 are not necessarily native German speakers. Yeah, so especially in multicultural societies, but also generally, this participation through deliberation is really entering its limits. And inclusion through action means that you rather do things with people together in public spaces to have to help them have a stake in urban development. That could be cooking, that could be gardening, that could be handicraft and tailoring, or there have been efforts of knitting practices. Yeah, so this is rather actions that are not necessarily requiring language as the first prerequisite. It could also be music. Yeah, music is very inclusive across languages. Yeah, so and then these centers also focus on alternative development paths for planning and architecture beyond traditional capitalist modes of urban development and territorialist urban restructuring. For example, all these initiatives that point to post-growth agendas. Yeah, and I've identified in an article published with Andrea Rigayande, the new vice study dean at the faculty, and her lecture, 4 centers that could be considered as witnesses of and protagonists of this new relational mainstream in architecture and planning. That's the Urban Design Institute at the HCU Hamburg, very, very dear colleagues working from a very practical and performative idea of urban design towards theorization, which very much fits with our approaches, coming from theory and working towards praxis. It's also the social design program at the Angewandte that some of you are already acquainted with. And you see also, and that's not a self-promotion, but also rather also a self-critical gaze, our own center, and of course the Future Labs platform with the field trips in public spaces. We all could fall into that new relational mainstream in architecture and planning. And as I said, self-critical, that means that on the one hand, of course, we could all tell you hours why we do that and why we promote that, but there's also a backside to that. And I've worked in my habilitation on that ambivalence that these new approaches might carry across if they not address everyday life and the social deep enough, but just on a superficial level. Yeah, so we need really to be very serious about what these approaches can bring to architecture and planning, especially in relation to democracy and in relation to society. But we also need to see their limits and also the new pitfalls they might, and aporias they might be confronted with and involuntarily producing somehow. Yeah. And their tenor is somehow public space is indispensable in developing contemporary educational curricula in our fields, but there's also a fusion of transdisciplinary social and relational terms. That's a very theoretical idea where people, and especially in cultural studies, talking about different terms in understanding our own scientific fields. And this idea of creation of extensions, that universities want to have an arm into society and want to, in many rectorates of universities, they think it's necessary that society understands science and that we're not so far away, that we are able to translate what scientists and researchers do for society. But I think from having worked extensively with different NGOs and in the field, we can learn a lot from them. And so it should not be just one directional, but definitely a dialogue where at the university can learn a lot from actually this work with these very important players doing very important work in the field. Yeah. And so this is more a bilateral or dialogical relation than just one way from the university towards the society. And what also is now very important that we talk recently a lot about co-production of knowledge in our fields. That means that we need to take so these transdisciplinary efforts and the knowledges that we gain much more serious, and also play something back, not just extract knowledge from other fields to enhance our own praxis, but also play something back and be very serious about what do we gain and what do we offer. So this idea, what are we offering to these groups and knowledge producers that we actually work with? Yeah. And feminist inspired conceptions include, for example, a shift in value systems through the integration of women's or other perspectives, emphasizing certain qualities such as connectedness, inclusiveness, and ethics of care. You have seen that we've just published an open access book on care in the city, and you can have a look at this for free. And the conception of everyday life, which I'm going to introduce you to. Subjectivity, which is quite contested in scientific realms, feelings, affect, complexity, and also flexibility in design. And that has been written by a famous architecture theorist, which is Jane Randall. Yeah. And these approaches, that's what I wrote in the habilitation, actually are exemplary of a trend of establishing new fields at university faculties that are concerned with the definition of space, and that gain again, or anew, investigate complex social relations and lived and built spaces. But to cut it short, the relation between urban life and urban form somehow. Yeah. And the second point is that if the social perspectives of disciplinary practice have been given greater significance recently, if this increases the emphasis on public spaces and aspects of urban culture, some have called them like the software or the soft aspects of urban development, then, and if this kind of new relational mainstream is gradually crystallizing in our fields, then this is not only a new topic, rather that was my finding, this transition bears witness to a profound change in the understanding of space, and also it reestablishes the connection between society, architecture, and everyday life. And I would have argued even before the start of the pandemic years that this has been very much needed in architecture. But I guess through the pandemics, we have realized, and the impacts that the pandemics had on our everyday lives, we realized that it's very important to understand the basic transitions of everyday lives that even have been unfolding before the pandemic started, and on top of that, the pandemic transitions. And that's something that we have been very much up to as a community of public space researchers in the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years. Yeah. Okay, so that's already the first part. And as I said, if any one of you has a question of understanding, we can have them briefly now, and then I would go on with the second part after that. And if possible, leave the discussion to the end. You can raise your hand or put them also to the chat, or put a star into the chat if you have any questions so far. Okay, if that's at the moment not the case, I hope you can follow. You're very much invited to grab a coffee, and if you need a coffee in between, it's early morning, yeah, or a tea. And if there's no, yeah.
Maybe it's, shall we have, let's try to have a short discussion. I think you're right, it would be good.
Okay.
If possible, please turn your cameras on when we talk, because it's more polite for our speaker. What about we talk about the last issues Sabine introduced? Have you for example, in your projects already included some of the aspects? Have you sort of spaces that can be used by more than, more people, not only the ones that you have planned for? Have you sort of spaces that invites a number of different users, peoples? Or have you designed spaces that can be used in various ways?
Sanna, can you speak up a little bit, because you're so, I don't know, maybe it's just my computer, but I don't understand you.
Okay, thank you for that. I think maybe the microphone is not working. Thank you, Franziska. So anyone, what's your idea, thoughts on public space and architecture? Lived space in architecture.
Maybe I will start. I had some thoughts during your presentation, and I really liked how you talked about including those different disciplinaries and working together, people from different university having different approaches. But I'm wondering, and it's also kind of experience I made, is that sometimes if you have too many people from different fields, it's kind of, or the result you get by them working on the same thing is at the end very often a compromise, and the compromise is sometimes really far away from the initial idea, and it's always then something like not or just a bad end result for everything, for everybody. And do you have experiences from that, Mrs. Knierbein, how you face struggles like that?
Should I direct directly, Sandra?
Yes, I think this would be best. Yes.
Okay. Yes, thanks, Franziska, for that question. And of course, it's a very good question. So first, I would say struggle would be good, yeah, because what you do when you work together with people who have another view, and just maybe another disciplinary view, is to learn to negotiate, and that's basic learning about how to maybe also employ democratic practices in your work. Yeah, and of course, from the artistic point of view of the architect wanting to have a clear design, that's problematic. Because of course, if you speak with one voice and you have one artistic idea, you could have a quite clear design. And have a look also at the urban design of dictators. Yeah, why have dictators been able to produce some massive urban design schemes that are very strong in their formal language? Yeah, because they didn't have to negotiate with so many voices. But on the other side, I guess what you could now, not just on the reflexive level, but also to give you maybe a hint how to follow up with these issues, you could decide if you work on a small interdisciplinarity or on a wide one. Yeah, what is done in science very often is that you choose maybe 3 or 4 different strands which you think are necessary for that project and that question, and work from there in a smaller interdisciplinarity. Whereas if you have a huge and very open interdisciplinarity, you should be open to the process and to the result. And that means, of course, finding maybe what you considered as compromise. I would rather consider it as a negotiated product, which could also last longer when built. Yeah, because that's also, if you build something with communities or neighborhoods and you have their approval, although they might change over time, it seems that the acceptance of what you build is then for longer time and not just for the moment it's being built. Yeah, so you build much more into larger processes. Okay.
Mhm. I think we do have to sometimes to say goodbye to our or to the meaning or understanding of architecture that we as architects should fulfill our own style and how I think so. It's kind of a maybe old way of thinking about architecture, that you as an architect always should be like, or everybody should know this is your architecture and you're just a good architect if you fulfill your own architecture in your career. And yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. And if you have a look at all the prize winners, Turner Prize winners, etc., like with Assemble, but also with the architecture collective that was rebuilding houses, this idea of repair, for example, and not new building has been gained prominence also recently. Okay.
Thank you, Franziska. Is there any other comment? I know we have some works on public space here. A few people are working on issues related to public space.
But maybe also after the next part, I will come back to public space in the next part. And if you want to think about it throughout the next part, then there's a pause after that.
Great, let's do this.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll share my screen again and we'll start with the part 2. So I hope you can see that again. I just have to shift something.
Sabine, we don't hear you. I think you...
Thank you. I was muted. You should be able to hear me now, hopefully. So as I said, now we come from the idea of public space to the idea of lived space, because there have been some problems with public space recently. And I will explain you why it's necessary to, let's say, to deconstruct and reconstruct public space. And that's why I introduced the conception of lived space. Okay. Ali Madanipur, who is a very prominent public space researcher and has been a visiting professor and is a dear colleague a couple of years ago, working with us here in Vienna, has written a seminal article about concepts and critique of public space. And he says that the critical evaluation, or he has called for a critical evaluation of the concept of public space. And he says that this concept started life as a critique of the neoliberal phase in urban development, let's say in the beginning of the 1980s in UK, for example, but has now been widely adopted by most stakeholders operating within that phase. Yeah, you have a lot of investors, entrepreneurs that embrace this idea of public space and that all involve the idea of public space in their renderings and drawings. Yeah. And this adoption, he says, is at odds with the needs for the provision and maintenance of accessible public spaces. And London is a key example for the privatization of public spaces. And as public authorities have embraced a more unternehmerisch, entrepreneurial approach, the concept and character of public space have also been changed because the public space rhetorics have been included into that entrepreneurial approach. So the rhetoric of public space as a space of interaction has remained, but it has become increasingly an instrument of attraction at the service of unequally distributed economic interests. And that's important because it was developed in critique of privatization, commercialization, and also what we call the commodification, to turn public interaction in public spaces into a commodity, something which you can sell. Yeah, that is commodification. So, and now it acts within that, with the actors working within that same phase. And as regards the conceptual limits of public space, Colin McFarlane, he is very much a researcher doing research on social infrastructures. He has emphasized that part of the success of these entrepreneurial strategies actually lies in their capacity to capture not just a new economic model, yeah, but also highly selective interpretations of the active social. And In urban development, the active social, so what we consider as being the active social, is redressed in urban development through public space mainly. And some of you have mentioned this idea of target groups, and the rhetoric of target groups, which I mentioned earlier, is actually one part of this being very selective about which publics you expect in a public space. In our community of public space researchers, we have raised alarm because public should be always inclusive. Yeah, should be always, we always need to think who's not included in a certain place. Yeah, not just think of people who are there, but of people and groups and individuals who are missing. Yeah, are the elderly in the public space? Are the migrants in the public space? Are the sort of nannies and housekeepers in the public space? Are the workers in the public spaces? So we could think of a lot of different groups, but when designing public spaces, have a look at who is there, but have always a second look at who's not there. And that's very important in order to understand what the public is. Whereas a target group is very much developed according to consumption potential. Yeah, in urban development, I have people being able to buy a flat at the price of, I don't know, XYZ euros. Yeah, so that is very much consumption potential oriented framing of target groups, and this comes from business economics, and we need to be careful to just transfer concepts from business economics, I guess, in our languages in planning and architecture, because we also have a democratic vocation. Yeah, or at least if we use it, we need to use it in a very reflected way. Okay. And other potential cracks in public space debates, this is a theoretical critique. So I mentioned Ali Madanipur, but also Mark Purcell, that is a neo-Marxist critique. So they say, as I just explained, that public space has moved from a critique to an orthodoxy embraced by most stakeholders or actors as an important part of urban development. And so this is called a co-optation at the expense of earlier ideals. And there's this old division that Mark Purcell discusses of der Gebrauchswert der Stadt, the use value, how we use the city and how we attach value to certain spaces through our uses, is positioned versus the exchange value, the Tauschwert. Yeah, and for Lefebvre, the city, the urban, was constituted by use value, whereas the city and, let's say, the monotonous urbanization of the past century which is free of use values, is very much based on exchange value. The second theoretical critique is a feminist critique that's very old, actually. You see that in the 1990s already, that is addressing this conceptual division into public and private spheres. And this was this is like a gender division, it was very much. And so this, the private was very much assigned, especially in the 80s, to the women and the household and to social reproduction and care. Whereas the public was the heroic, the male, the decision makers, etc. And so in the 1990s, this has already been criticized by, especially by feminist political scientists. And nowadays, what we invite students to see rather the private activities in the public and also the public activities in the private, to see how they are much more entangled. Yeah, though the division into public and private for the state is very important, because the state also has to protect our privacy as individuals. And you see, especially in times of home office and homeschooling, where the state pushes employers to offer home office, that this protection is losing ground somehow. And that's why we feel very much stressed, because our privacy and our private spaces is the last resort also for our bodies to find peace, to find something that is not work or not duty. And so if work and duty and discipline enter our private spaces of otium and musse and joy, then this is very problematic, because we need to find other places where our bodies can rest. Yeah. So this has been a debate that we had with a lot of students over the past 2 years. This division is somehow criticized, but also necessary. Yeah. And the third point is the post-political critique, that public space is considered in political science terms as the empty space of democracy. And that means that no political interest group should be able to appropriate public spaces for itself. Yeah, so that it should be always negotiated between different interests so that no group can completely appropriate it. And I guess in what we see in a lot of demonstrations currently are exactly these fights, not to let one group or one idea conquer public spaces, but really bring different opinions and attitudes to public spaces. Yeah, like the care for all, or we care for each other demonstration was a sign of that contestation of certain appropriations of public spaces. Okay, and so there is a thesis of an unoccupied city in political terms, and that has been by Nikolai Roskam, who's a dear friend and also has been a visiting professor. And he's one of the German-speaking, let's say, scholars introducing post-political thought into urban studies and planning. It's very important. And we ask also if public spaces indeed are specters of radical politics, of democratic renewal. That's what we're interested in, not the type of radical politics that is against democratic renewal. And if common practices per se need to be considered as a struggle or negotiation on how we can deal with that in our fields. And as I said, the public space debate has certain shortcomings, and we need somehow new triggers for these old debates in order to, let's say, rediscover the democratic potential of public spaces, also the critical potential of public space as a concept, and take it out of this mainstreaming back again. And as I said before, on the one hand, I have come to this idea of lived space. Lived spaces are actually the geographies of everyday life, whereas public spaces could be considered, as we heard on the first slide, as the geographies of the public sphere. And the public sphere is the things that we have as a community, as a society to agree on in common, the public service provision for everyone, das Gemeinwohl, das Gemeinwesen. Yeah, so these issues are discussed in public, also the public infrastructure, that everyone can have a decent way of life in the city. And that's the first point, that lived spaces is more than just that. Lived spaces also stretches into the private spaces and into how private spaces might become politicized as well. As I said, with this feminist critique on the division between private and public spaces somehow. Yeah, the politicization that what happens in the household is as political as what happens in the public spaces. And also lived space invites not just to look at public spaces, but also to look maybe at mobility or housing and see the connections between these fields that we discuss as separated fields very often in urban development or heritage protection. Yeah, so to see the linkages across these fields. And on a very empirical level of studies, we can say that lived spaces could be considered as these spaces of everyday life, geographies of everyday life, but on a more philosophical level, and that was a lesson to be learned from Lefebvre, lived space also acts as the geography of the human condition. And here there is a lot of political theory of Hannah Arendt inside, who has worked on the human condition. And if you want to understand the current human condition, which is very, very tricky to understand, because I guess we're very much in crisis with our thought on democracy, etc., over the last decade, then we really need to see how we can connect through urban studies more philosophical ways of thinking, but also very precise discussions, maybe about a table in a square like the Kolumbusplatz that we see in this picture. Yeah, to connect the everyday objects, the study of everyday objects, to connect the study of everyday places with the more philosophical ways of understanding the human condition, but also the more than human condition involving plants, animals, nanoparticles, viruses, etc. So that's, of course, something that's as important as well. And this idea of lived space also, and digging into the niches between different disciplinary bodies, is very much relating to this idea of the rest that Caroline Skuor and Anke Struver is professor for geography at the University of Graz, have introduced. And they said, and I translated that, that they promote a plea for the rest, to take rest in a twofold sense. First, to take a break with all the different turns that, especially in the social sciences, humanities, and cultural studies, have been highlighted. We had post-colonial turns and affective and performative and a lot of different turns, and that we should take a rest. And secondly, they said to dedicate during this break all efforts on emphasizing what has been left out in previous analysis. And they say we need to pay more empirical and also maybe methodological and theoretical attention to everyday life. And that's something, of course, I could very much work with when introducing this idea of lived spaces as being a broader idea than just public spaces. And lived space could serve now as an analytical corrective to this public space concept in crisis. And it would us allow to, sorry, I have to move something here on the screen. Allow to engage with deeper intellectual critique by framing space through the lens of everyday theorizing, but at the same time, because public space is in urgent need of critical recovery, but also lived space could conceptually fall into let's say, crisis at some point. And so then a re-strengthened public space concept could serve also as a corrective. So this is mutually corrective somehow. That's the idea of it. And the intention with introducing this lived space somehow as a counter concept to re-establish the democratic linkages of public spaces is not to deconstruct public space, but to start reconstructing critical features of public space through a counter argument or counter conduct. And this may start with an initial deconstruction, followed by a reconstruction, and indeed a co-construction of what we should understand as public spaces. Yeah. And the appreciation is that we talk about site-specific and contextualized planning and architecture practices, and our understanding would be enhanced to really dig into our own relation to democracy, to citizens, to urban questions of urban citizenship, community, society, and how we render groups in the city or how we not render them. And I've pointed to this example of target groups versus city publics. These employ different, more inclusive or less inclusive renderings of public spaces. And very often to architects, it's not clear that there is an immanent exclusion in the concepts. And that's why we teach what we teach here, to make you aware that not all words are equally inclusive, and that words also in our practices produce certain ways of access and inclusion somehow. Yeah, but not only, of course, our buildings and our sites do as well. So that was the second part. And Sandra, I share the screen. So if there's now more questions to public spaces, lived spaces, we can have them right now.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for turning on your cameras again. Okay, let's continue. Any question, comment to what you have heard in the second part?
Yes, I have a question.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I didn't manage how to raise my hand on my tablet, but I would like to ask you, because you was talking about the places where should everyone be included, like from different way of lives, from different economical sectors. And I would like to ask you about the spaces which are, for example, in the historical city centers of popular cities for tourists, which are basically crowded by tourists, and all the other uses like shops or restaurants are oriented for tourists. So maybe sometimes the residents of the city feels quite excluded from those spaces. And I would like to ask you how you see the tourism of the future. How can we maybe do something to make this space more public for all of the people, included the residents? And if the Corona crisis could be some kind of opportunity for us, or to open some potentials, how we can act to change this. Thank you.
Thanks, Alsbeta, for asking that question. Actually, when I was working as a visiting professor at the University of Firenze, we discussed very intensively the tourism issue, because in a city like Firenze, similar to Salzburg, you have the tourism very strongly interfering into the everyday life and services offered for residents, especially in these very historical city centers. And my colleagues in Firenze, they had done research on that already over 20 years. Yeah, they had warned the city that there is a monofunctionality of the urban economy in the city center, that you just have cafes addressing tourists and not so much cafes or bakeries addressing the locals anymore. So they had warned all the time. And suddenly when Corona entered, they were called by the municipality, because the municipality realized that they need to create a city for residents, actually, because all this tourism industry or tourism geared industry was, for a moment, at least in the first lockdown, breaking down. When there was no vaccination, no one was knowing how this pandemics would work. And actually, what we have in public space research is a strand of research into new urban tourism, which includes Airbnb. And this is also tricky. It's not the typical tourism, but it very drastically changes public spaces at the neighborhood levels as well. Then we have touristification. There's a lot of papers on touristification. And what my colleagues in Firenze did was actually working on foodification as a sub-phenomenon of touristification, where you get these mono-economic and monocultural, mono-social structures. And what many cities have learned throughout the pandemics is that they cannot go on developing city centers like this. And I know also from Graz, where I was invited to take part in the debate, that they were facing similar issues. And on the one hand, I mean, you ask for a new type of tourism. I'm not a tourism expert, I have to admit, so I'm quite reluctant to give any idea, but maybe what we should ask for all places in the city is, what's the everyday quality that these spaces offer? And if there's no everyday quality for the everyday residents, then there's should be a default mechanism saying we have to rethink that. Yeah, rather. And interestingly, if you want to search for economic principles, my colleagues here at the Institute of Financial Infrastructure, Leonard Planck, has been working on the issue of foundational economy, which means an everyday economy based on everyday needs of people. And they try to bring it in very strongly now via different parties in different cities in Germany, England, and Austria. So this idea that economies are just catering for external needs is in itself a bug. Yeah, so we need to rethink the urban economy from everyday needs somehow. And of course, consider the tourists within that spectrum, but also offer, for example, some people in Firenze told me, I'm not going to the city center anymore. Before, it was possible for me as a local to get an ice cream for €1 or €2, but now they ask me to pay 5, because they know that if I'm not coming as a local, the tourists will pay that, yeah, and they will sell it anyway. But so you need to introduce mechanisms, like in Rio de Janeiro, it's possible to go to the Pão de Açúcar, to the Zuckerhut, for locals at a third of the price than it is for tourists, yeah, so that the locals can also benefit from visiting it. Yeah, so we need to think about different ways to access also infrastructures that are actually important for everyone, not just for tourists, but also at the same time. And for tourists, it's also, I guess, nicer not to just have a commercialized touristified center, because they often think it's not authentic anymore. So for them, it might also, again, raise attraction to come to a city center that's still lived. I don't know if I answered your question sufficiently.
Yeah, thank you very much. You answered my question. Very good, thank you.
There's another question by Paul.
Yes. You said that it's very important to have like the private space as a kind of refuge or safe space for each person. So would you define the private space as like spatial, or is it a different concept? So where is the border between the private space and the public space, because in my experience, it's different for every person. So you can't always leave work at the doorstep from your home or something like that.
There's a fascinating, sorry, I was muted. There's a fascinating book on shelf, that's why I was looking at shelf, by Ali Madanipur on public and private spaces of the city. And he actually goes through these distinctions, both from a very personal and internal psychological level, then the level of the body as an interface between our psychology and the outer world, the urban world, and then more interpersonal levels between different people, between societies. So I guess what you address is that there is not just one view on how to distinguish private from public spaces, but it depends from which perspective you look. And in this book called Private and Public Spaces of the City by Ali Madanipur, he really goes through all these different layers, and we would even call them maybe scales, and tries to discuss that, and also how they interfere. So on the one hand, you're right, psychologically, or in terms of environmental psychology, everyone feels different degrees of publicness and privacy, and this is also culturally constructed as the way, for example, how people on the tube in Vienna take distance is different from the tube in Firenze, is different from the tube in Sao Paulo, is very much also how different ideas of proximity, closeness, even before the pandemics, were around in different parts of the world. So it's both a private issue, it's a culturally constructed issue, but then when coming to our field, architecture and planning, we have zoning, and we have clear zoning lines in the demarcation between what is considered as public and private. And there's a line where a house, the doorstep is, So I guess we need also to see that we are at the frontier of producing built borders or thresholds. And at the same time as these thresholds have been criticized as being problematic, as I mentioned, they are very much necessary in order to protect also our privacy somehow. And Ali Madanipur in that book, he very much elaborates why the state has a duty also to protect the privacy, that everyone can retreat and can relax somehow, and that this has been very much thrown into transition throughout the pandemics with all this home office, homeschooling, homework issues. I don't know whether your question is still open.
No, I think most of it is answered.
Okay, good.
Okay, is there any more question? Otherwise, we move to the third part. Sabine?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So now we come to the part where I would first like to introduce, now we have moved from public space to lived space. And I will now move from lived space to everyday life and explain you why there has been already an approach called critique of everyday life in the past century, and why I felt the need in my when I was establishing this new emerging field at our faculty to re-establish, let's say, a critique of everyday life in the 21st century in our field. And from there, we move then to the linkages to architecture, theorists that have sort of presented different approaches and how they relate to everyday life. Okay, that's the idea of this part, so that you have a root in mind. So first, why key emerging fields in architecture? So as I said, with this habilitation, a new venia docendi was introduced at our faculty that's called urban studies. So we didn't have urban studies before as a field here at TUWien, but it existed before at other universities, though in different disciplinary fields, sometimes in geography, sometimes in the social sciences, sometimes in planning and engineering, and sometimes in the arts and architecture, sometimes relating to landscape architecture. So, and we have it now at the faculty, and I felt that it's my duty also not just to bring all these insights from the social sciences and humanities into this developing the concept of everyday life, but also to develop these links to existing planning approaches and existing architecture approaches on the very conceptual level first, yeah, and then we see how we can relate it to different forms of praxis. So I deepened the scientific exploration and the framing of urban studies, and in German it's called internationale Urbanistik. In English, urban studies is international per se, but in German it's not that international if you call it urbanistic. That's why there was a distinction. As a field of fields, that's not a discipline. And the proceedings were first, so my goals were to, was a first move to overcome a narrow and partly very much a formative frame of urban culture and public spaces. As I said to you, and as I told you in part 2, we have this critique of this very superficial idea of public spaces that became co-opted, so that we need to move to deeper forms of critique here. My second move in that habilitation treatise was to get closer towards key positions that actually seek to theorize planning, architecture, and urban design with a focus on everyday life and lived space. And my third focus was then to develop a more everyday theory-based approach to urban studies in the community of urban studies professionals, as its key relations of learning to introduce an understanding that is first intersectional, and I will explain you later on that part. Non-holistic, that's a different lecture. I invite you, but we can talk a lot about holistic and non-holistic approaches to science and to our field. Interscala, so the everyday life is not micro. The everyday life is not the micro scale. Yeah, it's actually the scale where macro transitions of global urbanization, of global economic globalization, climate change, and meso transitions like institutional and policy shifts, but also shifts in our social action and cultures on the more micro level interfere. And that has been a key error in this literature and urban studies so far, that everyday life was always considered as micro. It's not micro, it's everything fused into an experiential level from which we can both philosophize, but also be very concrete about, as I said, meanings of tables in concrete squares, for example. Yeah, and so that is interscala and worlded in the sense that we co-produce knowledge on everyday life, not just from the West and not just from Eurocentric positions, but very much also from a worlded position that learns also from Southern scholars and other ways of thinking. And my approach then was that to develop an understanding of special scientific field of fields in which expert knowledge from various disciplines is accepted as being relevant, depending, of course, on the urban phenomenon studied, yeah, but also where this can be confronted, discussed, and combined with other forms of urban knowledge in the transdisciplinary ways. Let's say these extensions into society, the work with NGOs, etc. Yeah. And urban studies comprise a space and place-based understanding, both of, as I said, an introduced urban societies and urban relations. That was the first part in my habilitation treatise, but then also urban development, let's say strategic urban planning, strategic urban design, and also urban development and urban routines. But also, and I mentioned that earlier before as well, on which type of urban professions are changing how, and also how should we engage with pedagogies and urban education. So we need to see urban studies as developing, let's say, expertise in all these fields and in the combination of these fields. And Stuart Eldon, who is a scholar of the work of Henri Lefebvre, the French social philosopher that I mentioned earlier, said that everyday life may be familiar to us, but this does not mean that it is understood. And he says that analyzing the everyday may bring about the extraordinary in the ordinary. Yeah. So we need to take somehow an analytical distance in order to look at what seems very familiar and random and part of the furniture for us, in order to see the shifts and changes and how we might come to the fact of imagining a different version of everyday life that makes us maybe happier or more peaceful. Yeah. And Ben Highmore, who's a cultural studies and sociology scholar publishing books on how to theorize the everyday, says that it is to the everyday that we consign that which no longer holds our attention. Things become everyday by becoming invisible, unnoticed, part of the furniture. And he says, if familiarity does not always breed contempt, it does encourage neglect. So he says, because we have not looked at everyday life analytically and the changes in everyday life, we have very much neglected to discover a brilliant subject of investigation from which we can learn a lot about our contemporary society, about social movements in public spaces, and about issues of democracy. Yeah. And what I did in the book is I worked from two angles. First part was from the social sciences and humanities. Second part was from our fields of architecture and planning theorization. And I looked from both sides mutually at what we call more than capitalist urbanization in the 21st century. Yeah. So this is very much has been a trend in urban studies that we understand urbanization as a vehicle of capitalism in growing and expanding and changing. But by now, it's not just only capitalism that we're interested in. These are aspects of colonialism. These are aspects of empire. These are aspects of whatever comes to our mind, what is important to understand the current urban condition and societal condition. Yeah. And leaving openness there as well. So the word everyday, or in French quotidien, designates the entry of daily life, or la vie quotidienne, into modernity. Yeah, and the concept of everydayness, quotidianité, stresses the homogeneous, the repetitive, the fragmentary in everyday life. And that was very much an introduction with industrialization, that we have this monotony entering into our everyday lives. Yeah, and whereas the idea of the everyday and of everydayness is not the same as simply everyday life or daily life. These terms, the latter terms, were more often used to refer to the uncatalogued, habitual, or routine nature of day-to-day living, rather than used critically to refer specifically to the alienated, dry everydayness of daily life. So whereas everydayness and this boring everyday life refers to the alienated condition, Entfremdung, yeah. So capitalism has transformed our everyday lives into something that's more boring, that's where we don't feel much more joy, etc. Yeah. And Lefebvre's statement was, capitalism has seized the countryside. Yeah, we have agriculture being put in under the sort of workings of capitalism. We have capitalism has appropriated the city, and the last bastion that capitalism appropriates is everyday life. And usually, and he said that like 30 to 40 years ago. Yeah, and what we can draw from that now is that capitalism works much more into what we understand as the social, yeah, appropriates what is the social, interferes into our homes with, I don't know, usually I use this example of the smartphone, yeah. 15 years ago on the tube, hardly anyone was having a smartphone. Some were having a mobile phone, but not everyone was reading on the phone and as part of the information society. But now on the tube, you would find nearly every second person, if not more, that is using the smartphone. Yeah, so but that's capitalism direct link to our everyday life somehow. So this is one part. Yeah, and this idea of a vivid, meaningful everyday life is a freed everyday life, an everyday life where we can have joy, where we can have creative and artistic expression. Yeah, that's a bit opposed in that literature. Yeah, and Lefebvre took this paradox between capitalism's seizure of everyday life and society's pushes to free ourselves from that again and again. This ambivalence, he took it into a spatial critique of alienation of the human condition, with lived spaces being these geographies of this human condition, as I said before. And in the lived spaces of the city, everyday life, now reinterpreted as a conceptual tool of critique, as it bears both this dialectic of the ordinary and the alienated, inscribes itself into the material and built arrangements of the urban fabric. And any attempt to intervene into the urban fabric, that's to all of us planners, designers, etc., conversely means the unsettling of everyday urban routines and practices, and thus of everyday life. We need to be very careful and I don't know, decades-long debates on gentrification have shown us that very often urban design interventions, they produce manifest shifts in everyday life, that people are not able to live there anymore. They have to move away because they cannot afford the rents anymore, for example. So what I urge you to think when you do your designs, make yourself comfortable with the place, visit the place, talk to people, and try to see what this intervention, what type of impacts will it have on the place, especially on the more vulnerable and poor parts of the population. Okay. And the spatial arts offer both new chances and opportunities for an enhanced quality of life for everyone in the city. But spatial interventions of planners, designers, and architects can also contribute to accelerating processes of gentrification, displacement, and dispossession. And if you want to read about dispossession, there is the diploma thesis of Raphael Essel on working homelessness in Silicon Valley, which, yeah, you can draw a lot from. So we have a lot of empirical evidence from very innovative cities on how the social inequality is very much pushed to levels where people are not just pushed out of homes into other homes far away through gentrification, but they are pushed out of homes into not anymore homes, but vans and mobile tents, etc., because there is no homes anymore for the Silicon Valley's blue collar workers. Yeah, so have a look at Raphael Essel's work. I can just type that into the chat. Yeah, Raphael Essel. You can find that on the library. Okay. Okay, I come back from the chat back to the lecture. Sorry, takes a second. But so then there's an idea of deep space by Neil Smith, who lamentably already died. And he says by deep space, he does not simply mean the sheer immensity of absolute space, the physical extent of near infinitive universe as measured in light years, but rather he refers to relativity of terrestrial space and the space of everyday life in all its scales, from the global to the local, and the architectural, he says, in which different layers of life and social landscapes are sedimented onto and into each other. Deep space for him is quintessentially social space. It is physical extent, like physically built space, fused through with social intent. And urbanity in that sense can be understood as a source thick with opportunities to empirically study deep space and to engage with everyday life, by both studying both, let's say, the ordinary and liberated ways to live one's and the possible spaces how we could live our everyday lives, and the currently much more alienated ways of how we live our everyday lives, especially under pandemic conditions, but also before. And everyday life research allows for a critical understanding of the changing spaces of the social world under capitalism, but as I said, also beyond capitalism. Yeah. And to put it as simply as possible, Ben Heimer said, the everyday is not as it appears. It's not just phenomenology. It's not just the phenomena that we see. Or rather, behind the everyday, or alongside or underneath the appearance of everyday life, lies another actuality, that is different mechanisms that influence on how our everyday life is lived. And here everyday life is understood as first a realm for the expansion of capitalist modes of production. Here we have alienation back again, but also a sphere through which society can be administered. This is a bit more biopolitics and Foucault, but also, and that has been a key issue that we have been writing about in the recent years, a transformative place of new insurgent geographies of becoming, be it through social movements, be it through new municipal practices of catering for vulnerable groups, or be it through market interventions that try to really sort deep social problems. I can tell you that I guess, what's the name of the French aircraft company? Can someone help me just? So the French, Air France. Air France and the Airbus company, for example, in Toulouse, there was one engineer whose childs were actually, I don't know if it's still politically correct to say, but hörbehindert, deaf mute. We wouldn't say taubstumm, but gehörlos now in German. And so he said he developed from being acquainted with sign language and gestures language. He actually introduced gestures language as a new language in Airbus for the crews, but also like for the crews, but also when building Airbus. And so they took something that was developed out of need in order to bring it as a social innovation into the wider society, which would also change the position of people facing that disability or that handicap, because they were now enabled as becoming experts of their own language and teaching others into how to use that in everyday life. That's just also an example of how the market could contribute to become a transformative place of something that brings a benefit, a democratic benefit to society somehow. Yeah. And research on cities, urbanization, and urban societies in social theory and in geography, there was a reassertion of the spatial dimensions into the social theory, like Edward Sawyer, who also has passed away lamentably 2 years ago. Edward Sawyer talked about that. We need to spatialize the social. And for our fields, we are the spatial experts. I took that vice versa, and I said we need to socialize the spatial. Yeah, in the sense that Sawyer has called for the spatial arts, so we need to reinterpret his findings because we have the need to shift his plea into our own plea for critical social perspectives in contemporary spatial theory and analysis, to come to terms with the sort of intertwined and really inseparable nature on social spatial features and relational material aspects of lived space. So the social and the material are always bound together, they are entangled. And these felt abstractions between the spatial and the social in the spatial arts need to be overcome when it comes to theorizing lived space as the geography of everyday life. And Andrew Merrifield, who is also a critique of Lefebvre's work, says that nobody can get beyond everyday life, which literally internalizes global capitalism, just as global capitalism is nothing without many everyday lives of real people in real time and space. Yeah, so in urban analysis, these levels have been so largely separated from each other that we have called in the urban studies community to fuse them back into studying everyday life again and not disentangle them. Yeah. And Bertolt Brecht, now we come to the more prosaic forms, has said that before familiarity can turn into awareness, the familiar must be stripped of its inconspicuousness. And he says also from, let's say, the Holocaust memories and the Holocaust experience, we must give up assuming that the object in question needs no explanation. However frequently recurrent, modest, vulgar, it will now be labeled as something unusual. And of course, both Brecht and Hannah Arendt were facing the time when what the Nazis first introduced as something very weird and very unnormal and very far away from everyday reality, the Nazis managed to bring that into becoming a new everyday reality. And that's why the Third Reich was developing. And so what these thinkers point to is that we shouldn't accept these new realities as given. They are constructed, and we need to understand which mechanisms construct them. Yeah. And now coming to that part with the bridging towards architecture theory. So the first part was rather introducing you a bit more to the social sciences and humanities part, but also the third part of my habilitation then did this bridging. And what I did is I developed, I wanted to have a bit more an analytical conception. How can we analyze lived space? So I wanted to qualify the analysis through what I called an intersectional approach. And the first section was on embedding that, framing that urban restructuring in a bit more Foucauldian fashion. And then I introduced theorizations of the ordinary dimensions of lived space, of the relational dimension, of the embodied dimension, the performative, the affective, the political, and the world dimensions of lived spaces, because different bodies of literature, both in the social sciences and humanities, that's That's the point we see here. That's the branch from the social sciences and humanities where this has been developed. But I was also seeing how this mediates or resonates into planning theory, but also architecture theory. And we will now look at this part. Yeah. So the framing of urban restructuring, and I guess we have like, I would say that 10 minutes left, more or less, and then we'll have 10 minutes for debate. If that's okay with you, Sandra. If not, I will shorten. So with thanks. And there's also a chat notice. I don't know what it is, but we can have a look at that. So settling everyday life and lived space conceptually in debates about urban restructuring and in urbanization was important, also with an emphasis on economic revival, social inclusion, cultural diversity, environmental care, and urban governance. So we have both social, cultural, political, ecological, and economic aspects fusing into our analysis, and also looking at, for example, at the moment, we very much look at the ecological and the social aspects and how they are entangled, but also at the cultural and the political aspects and how they are entangled in everyday life and policies. And also there was a need to distinguish between what we call the post-Fordist phase of urban development. So Henry Ford developed together with the state in the US welfare state principles that would facilitate workers also to buy their own cars and to have working a ban on too much working hours so that they could become good consumers as well. So this is called as Fordist phase. And in urban development, this was accompanied with the extensive laying out of suburban patterns of urban development, street construction, urban dwellings in order also to sell cars. So this was very much related. And the post-Fordist phase is marked with the breaking down of especially car-oriented industrial routines, but also other industrial routines. And so since the 1970s, the Bretton Woods Agreement and the oil price shock, we start to talk about post-Fordism in urban development because the industries are restructuring and car-oriented urban development is not that much interested anymore. So then there's a revival of the inner city policies, etc. So we made these distinctions between post-Fordist and Fordist, and also between post-Fordist and neoliberal urban policies, adding also distinctions between policies based on principles on the one hand of neoliberalism, which is laissez-faire, but also those grounded in idée-faire, which is ordoliberalism. And who's interested in that, Foucault wrote a very interesting book on that, how ordoliberalism and later neoliberalism were introduced in Germany through the post-war sort of, let's say, post-war engagement of especially the US, but also Britain and other sort of occupiers in Germany to establish a certain economic regime. And how then they moved from ordoliberalism to more neoliberalist tendencies. And Germany, in that sense, is one of the birth countries of neoliberalism. That's interesting in the sense of Foucault. And tracing the genealogy of different paradigmatic shifts and theorizing planning, architecture, and urban design with a focus on everyday life and lived space. And here the focus is a bit more on the governmentality of urban restructuring with its inherent omnipresent power relations. So that was just the frame. And Nan Allen, who is a very famous postmodern urban design theorist, said that since urban design interventions invariably have an impact on people's lives, the work of urban designers is inevitably political, whether or not we as architects or designers choose to be politically engaged or not. Yeah, but the denial of urban design's political component contributes to exacerbate existing inequalities. So she says you cannot hide away from taking a political position, whatever that is, in urban development as an urban designer. And particularly as regards the positioning of the role of the architect in new governance arrangements, Hilde Heinen and Gwendoline Wright, who are also two quite well-known architecture theorists, substantiate that power is relevant when discussing the privileged role of the architect, but also when analyzing presumptions about the individual and the public, including the client, or when investigating the social and environmental impacts of buildings. And they conclude that the architectural praxis and spatial interventions can sustain, question, or modify political and social structures of power. And if our disciplines and we as working in these disciplines can do that, then of course this could lead to enhancing or undermining democratic principles. So the whole role of our democratic engagement, I guess, is very much discussed here. And coming to the section 1, this ordinary dimension of lived space. So John Friedman, who's a planning theorist, who has lived in Vienna but was also a refugee from the Holocaust, and he moved to the US, said that cities need to be understood as dense, complex, and often contradictory webs of meanings. And however difficult to disentangle, they are essential to the good life. Yeah. And he says also that lived space mainly has been considered as a microrealm of everyday life, as opposed to macro structural forces. And as I have explained to you earlier, I have deconstructed that separation. So according to Margaret Crawford, the book I showed to you earlier, everyday life is a good starting point into the practice of ordinary and everyday urbanism. It is grounded in the commonplace rather than the canonical, and the many rather than the few, and the repeated rather than the unique. So this maybe is to the comment we had earlier on what role the architect has or not. And here is a focus on rhythms and routines of everyday life rather than just on capitalist versions of linear time. So this idea of time is very important here as well. And for the ordinary dimension, we have a very important German-speaking contribution from the 1970s. Werner Duert is an architecture theorist, I guess, based in Darmstadt, still teaching or just receiving his pension. And he wrote a book that was called Inszenierung der Alltagswerk zur Kritik der Stadtgestaltung. And Duert presented this book that dealt with how urban designers would ornament the dreariness, the boredom of urban everyday life in the urban centers of post-World War II Germany. And the book was published actually in the year that I was born, in 1977, and openly reflects a theoretically based critique of the then urban design praxis prior to postmodern debate. And Duert did a very detailed urban design analysis and takes build and design space as an analytical entry point to unravel the spatial particularities of the then Fordist urban development, their pitfalls and aporias. And Duert was interested in how actually the contemporary urban realities were masked through means of urban design. And this everyday social reality was characterized by an increasing presence of ruptures and contradictions, and was just thus sort of in an aestheticized fashion. Urban design had been used to brush over and to gloss over these social contradictions. And this is also the reason why the author argued against the positively connotated association of the city and urban space as a stage, ja, als der öffentliche Raum als eine Bühne oder die Stadt als eine Bühne. As for him, the act of turning the built environment into a stage was to understand urban design as a praxis of aesthetization, yet not a professional praxis catering for the societal interest. So he puts aesthetization and social concerns as opposed to each other. And I guess the question of nowadays is rather how we can have an aesthetic approach to urban design at the same time as including social aspects, not maybe branding the two as opposed to each other. And he also coined this as a compulsion to fiction, or the victory of fiction over social reality, whilst he was fully aware of the functionality of fiction. So he said that the associated goal of fiction was to create new needs and new materialities for the consumer society that was emerging in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And in the German-speaking debates on architecture history, urban design and theory, not just that book, but all of Duert's work can be thus understood as a key reference to introduce the critique of everyday life and to understand the power relations and social impacts of architecture, planning and urban design praxis. And I can just recommend you to other books, or at least one other book of Werner Duert, where he analyzes the architects and planners' involvement in the Nazis' Eastern extension, and how Nazis after the Second World War came back into important position, but had served the Nazis beforehand. And the book is called Träume in Trümmern. I just recommend for everyone in our disciplines to read that book. Yeah, and even beyond. Träume in Trümmern by Niels Gutschow and Werner Duert. Very important book. So the relational dimension of space also that's the next dimension, links to the study of relational aspects addressing tension fields of inclusion, exclusion, innovation, crisis, presences, absences, peace and conflict, and uneven development is sort of, as Smith said, is social inequality blasoned into the geographical landscape. And it's simultaneously the exploitation of that geographical unevenness for certain socially determined ends. And here in Weimar, there was a conception of Alternative Urbanistik developed. We even have a project in the module now in the spatial planning modules that we call Alternative Urbanistik as a course. This is about inclusive urbanism, critical urbanism, contextuality and relationality as key features inherent to any spatial praxis, and the continuous emergence of the social. So the social is not just there, but new ideas emerge, and our social action might also emerge into different directions that we expect it to develop. And these are place-based and people-focused approaches to urban and public policy and seeing products and production processes of urban design in relation. And social relations, that we did have that already earlier. And as it's already 10 to 11, Sandra, I might stop here without necessarily going through all these other dimensions, because we took a bit more time to discuss, but maybe I stop with the open dimension and saying that the open dimension of lived space, again, coming back to what Anke Struve and Caroline Schur said, I had introduced these 7 dimensions as a sectional analysis, but what's very important in urban studies that we never ever close things, but we leave open. And I just, I've just explained these 2 dimensions to you, and I'm happy to explain this later on for everyone who still wants to learn about that. But intersectionality means that we work across these dimensions and always see which dimensions are lacking and not yet there. And how society develops and changes, we need to also develop new dimensions of analysis. And maybe to close this very conceptual lecture, apologies for that, and the long lecture, is that my key concern to introduce the social back into architecture has been that the social is the basics also to understand the more political and democratic and cultural aspects of our profession. And we are in a time of deep unsettlement through different types of crises, but we also need to overcome the crisis rhetorics. And because we also have been the disciplines that were able to be visionary. And I guess I would invite everyone to very much be visionary once again, because we need a lot of people who are at the moment help to give visions for others, because so many people are, like, let's say, so much unsettled and feel insecure. And it's very important to orient people. And I guess from our disciplines, we have learned how to become visionary and how to become also transitional in our ways of thinking. And I would just encourage everyone to not just let ourselves be kept by this dystopian spirit of the time at the moment, but be very, not utopian, but be very visionary in a positive sense of thinking how democracy and our professions can work together, how we can help democratization through what we do. And that's all for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine. Wonderful conclusion, fits really well to the topics of our module. Yeah, it's important to be active, right? To be active and do something for the future. And interesting as well that you also, from another perspective, have the opinion or emphasized even that now is the creation happening of tomorrow's world. We had this discussed in various other ways. Thank you very much. Beautiful. We have a few questions in the chat. I also have a question, but I let Franziska say her comment first, I think, please.
Yes, it was just a comment during the presentation, so that everyday life is also a victim of its own everyday presence, and we are so used to it, and that habit of being used to it is at the same time the barrier of developing or improving or even debating about everyday life.
That's very nicely summarized. Yeah. A victim, it's both a victim of that, but if we turn that the other way around, it's also a huge opportunity then, yeah, if we acknowledge that.
Okay, Carmen, you had a question, please. Okay, maybe Carmen doesn't hear me at the moment. Then I have a question to Sabine. You talked about the mechanism of space construction, understanding the mechanism. And I'm very much interested in this, you know, as a mechanism, but also how can we teach that? How can we communicate that? Because I have the feeling that this mechanism of space has to be translated, I don't know, every few generations anew. So
yes. So that was also my driving motivation, because when we analyzed urban phenomena, we were so much always referring to Simmel, Marx, and the old great guys of the past century, which are important. And Foucault is not that old, but and Lefebvre is not that old either. But these are from 60s, 70s, and 80s. But still, there was no one that had theorized the urban condition from the contemporary perspective. And I was like, I didn't talk so much today about that, but in the first part and in the last part, I heavily involved recent contributions. For example, Asaf Bayat is a scholar who has analyzed social life and everyday life resistances in cities of the Middle East, and he very much has challenged this idea of Western social movement. So we have a protest idea, we go to a street, we protest, and then at some point it might enter into politics in a reformist way. But he said, no, we need to pay attention to that. Lot of social change is happening silently in everyday life by many people doing the same thing, but in a fragmented way. So that were his insights. And what I took from that for our disciplines is, yes, on the one hand, we need, if we want to come to the mechanisms, we can have loud conferences on, I don't know, neoliberal urban policies, etc., and Foucauldian perspectives. But then at the same time, I guess we need to, through our own everyday praxis, change our own structures from within. Yeah. So because we are also part of this, it's not just that we analyze that, but we are part of this. We talk to investors, etc. We talk to young students that just finalized their diploma thesis and how. And what I did, for example, now is I knew that a colleague is entering into an office where she has been working for a long time, and she enters as an engineer, but she has the potential to become a partner there very soon. And I was coaching her when submitting her diploma thesis, how to negotiate to become a partner in that office in 2 years. Yeah, but this is more a feminist approach to also pushing people into positions in order also to change the contemporary structures, which are somehow, I guess, hindering us to read the mechanisms somehow. Yeah. So I guess work in our own structures, but also I saw that you had a contribution by Simon Güntner as well. So we are teaching a lot, for example, ethnography classes, where we also teach students the methods to get beyond what we see. Yeah, to analyze not just what we see. But this is very particular and is very much to this, let's say, analyzing life in housing and analyzing life in public space. But what Sandra, what you were referring to as well, was actually that every generation we need to renew it constantly. And that's, I guess, that was my claim, to have this open analytical dimension, that we can never close this. We can never say these 8 dimensions are now fixed, and that's how we analyze. How everyone should analyze everyday life, yeah. But we need to constantly see what are the transformations Maybe we need more knowledge on health at the moment, or we need more ecological knowledge, or maybe we need more knowledge on how to deal with code space because the algorithms are just overruling our understanding of how a space is produced. I don't know. Yeah, so we need to be very visionary in that and leave our way of not remain dogmatic in the way we analyze, but try to be open all the time to what might come in anew. I don't know if that answered your question.
It opened it up.
Okay.
There is a placebo answer to this question, right? It was a very, very great a line of information related to the question and opening up, yeah, what we as architects have to learn even more, or same as urban planners, because there's a lot of flexibility involved, right? This transformation, and that's the challenging part for building.
Yeah, I mean, the build structures, they have a more, let's say, they have a different life cycle. And what we do now a lot, we talk about temporalities and how temporalities of social and the build may sort of be rhythmic in concept at some moment, but be arrhythmic in others. So this idea of infusing time in this understanding of space is very helpful to bring the social and the build together back again. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. There is one question from Carmen. She cannot ask it directly, but I would like to read it to you. Do you see change checkups still as an important and influential part of the urban research studies, or is it outdated? Still haven't finished the book, but like your spirit, Carmen says.
So I guess reading the Deaths of Great American Cities, for example, is very helpful to get the spirit of why we should care for cities and why people have been caring for cities before. I would say that she's both relevant and outdated, so it complicates the mission, because her work has been criticized also very much as being not so much class and ethnography or ethnically sensitive as it could have been. Yeah, so especially from post-colonial scholars, there has been a fierce critique also of her views in a nowadays perspective. But the debate we have now on these aspects, she didn't have so much before. Yeah, so you can read her to get into it, but then also read her critiques, I would suggest.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabine. Is there one last question, because we are really at the end of our time? Marcel, is this hands up for question?
Yeah, I have one last question. It was very interesting. And but I personally like working in the field. It's very difficult to implement like the theoretical knowledge that you give us into my work, or like, of course I can look into my everyday life and maybe change something, or maybe look to have a vision. But is there like a concrete maybe field where you see like that needs improvement now, or like here there's like maybe, I don't know, concepts for working together, or so like concretely that we maybe need to look at if we are working in the field?
Yeah, of course. I mean, in one conceptual lecture unit, it's not possible to draw you all the linkages, but of course we have that. I have that in a lecture series where we work a lot with case studies also on theorizings of space. But what we have done also in cooperation with the sociologists is that we very much digged into the relation between public space and housing, yeah, via this lived space analysis. And so what happens in housing is often not so much visible in public space, and what happens in public space is often not so much visible in housing. And for example, one example is my colleague is working on intergenerational aspects and aspects of aging. And the people who stay at home, because the old people who stay at home because they cannot leave the home anymore, you wouldn't be able to do an interview with them in public space. But you will find those that are mobile in public space that tell you about those that are at home. And then you can track those at home and do interviews with them. So this linkage is not just staying in one field like mobility or, I don't know, social infrastructure or housing or public space work. This is not just a concept, but it's a way of proceeding. Try to always work the interfaces with other fields. And but with that, you do already do everyday theorizing somehow. Yeah, it's more a proposal for a procedure. Yeah. But there have been, for example, I didn't present that when it comes to the performative dimension of lived space. There have been in architecture already concepts like performative planning by Uwe Altrock and Sandra Huning, and also performative urbanism by Sophie Wolfrum at TU Munich. Yeah, so in some of these dimensions there are already fully developed concepts, in others not. Yeah, but I just took it from the theoretical level of what has already been theorized. Some of them are already conceptually developed in praxis, and others are not yet. Yeah, does that suffice, or do you want to learn more?
No, I think it suffices. Yeah, it's very difficult also, I think, and because it's new, or we have to find new ideas also. I mean, but
yeah.
Performative planning is something. I mean, I will look into it more.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabine. Thank you very much for the questions. And yes, it was very interesting add to the module and introduction to the research that you do. Thank you. It's very important as a cross discipline, right? In our faculty, architecture and urban planning. So good that you're here at the TUWien, and good that the students have some possibilities to come to you and work with you. You also offer some modules. Do you offer one module this semester?
The coming semester, I'll offer a bachelor introductory module, and we're also offering a project, Alternative Urbanistik, which is part of the module. But usually we offer most parts of the module in the winter term. But we also have diploma and doctoral study seminars. If you're wanting to write your diploma thesis, I have actually as many architects writing diploma theses with me as I have planners. And we don't distinguish so much, because anyone interested in urban phenomena should come. Yeah, I'm happy to tutor all of them. And we also will develop a concept for die Raum, the Raumplanerinnen-Ausstellung. And if you're interested in that, it will be the next one. So it's not an Arts Diploma for Raumplaners, but it's rather a wider exhibition what is being produced in spatial planning. And I would be very much welcoming if we have some contributions from architecture as well, not to separate these fields too much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. Have a good day.
Thank you so much to you, Sandra, and to everyone listening, and apologies for the long lecture.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.